Precious few days remain until the midterm elections as political prognosticators take a stab at predictions. But most don't have Ann Selzer's data. We sit down with one of America's leading pollsters on this edition of Iowa Press.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.
For decades, Iowa Press has brought you politicians and newsmakers from across Iowa and beyond. Now celebrating more than 40 years of broadcast excellence on statewide Iowa Public Television. This is the Friday, October 26th edition of Iowa Press. Here is David Yepsen.
In many election years, reporters and voters pore over polling data to gauge public opinion. In 2018, with Iowa hosting competitive races for governor, Congress, and the Iowa legislature, Ann Selzer leads the Des Moines Register's Iowa poll, and she's one of the few who can gauge the political pulse here. And today she joins us at the Iowa Press table. Ann, welcome back.
Thank you.
Good to have you here.
Not everybody, I think, who sits in this chair is all that happy to be here, but it really is a pleasure to be here.
We're glad to have you. Across the table, James Lynch is political reporter for the Gazette, and Kay Henderson is news director for Radio Iowa. Ann, I'd like to start, instead of Kay, we usually start with Kay. Yeah. I'd like to start by talking about some of the data that you have from the last Iowa poll that you brought with you, some graphics. I'd like to get a sense from you of the race for governor. Who's ahead? What's the status of it?
Well, I'll say to you that it is a close race. By the end of the time in the field, it was a 2-point race with Fred Hubbell up over Governor Kim Reynolds. During the time we were in the field, the lead did shift. So that tells us something about the volatility of this race. So there's some underlying things that kind of say a little bit about that story. And I think we have some slides about that. That Kim Reynolds does especially well in rural areas, where she's up 27 points. That's a big part of the state, and as you kind of imagine the map of Iowa, where you would expect to see a Republican doing particularly well. She also does well with evangelicals, and those two things tend to go together. Those are
the best groups for her.
Her two best groups for that. A couple of things that are consistent and that we find in races lately is that she wins the race with Catholics. She wins the race with Protestants. She also does well with men. But let's just focus on religion for a second, because you might think about it. If you've won with Catholics and you've won with Protestants, how is she behind overall? And that is because Fred Hubbell's best group is this little understood group I call the nuns. That is, when you ask someone their religious alignment, they say none. That's now 16% of the Iowa electorate, bigger than most people think. Fred Hubbell wins that group by 36 points. So he offsets Kim Reynolds' lead among Protestants and Catholics to end up in the lead overall. That's always a group that I pay attention to.
What do you make of the fact that Fred Hubbell is doing better among women? Does that strike you as a little ironic that more women aren't for the first woman governor of Iowa?
It kind of says that it's not the big deal it used to be. It's not symbolically important the way it might have been several years ago. And you certainly have seen the gender gap growing, especially in this election. So it's not just in this race that you see a strong Democratic alignment with women more likely to support the Democratic candidate and men more likely to support the Republican candidate.
If memory serves from the last Senate race, Joni Ernst did not carry the female vote, did she?
See, now you're asking me a question.
That's about actual results.
Do you have that number written down on your piece of paper?
I'm interested, this poll that you took
in sort of toward the late part of September? Remind me when this was in the field.
I think it was around mid to late September,
okay.
Yes.
And you found 9% of people were on the graphic not sure.
Yes.
Are these really undecided voters? What does history tell us about this group of people?
Well, the number, the size of the number, the 9%, is not all that surprising. So they've told us, in order to get into this part of the poll, that they are definitely going to vote. So they've answered the strongest way that they could to say that they are voters. And it could be that they care a lot more about something else that's going on in the election and not that much about the governor's race. They're just not yet decided on that. Or they're just maybe less committed, that they're habitual voters, they always vote, it doesn't matter that much. What we know is that they tend to be younger and therefore sometimes less likely to show up. People always wonder and ask me, well, which way do they break? And the answer is, I can line up for you 100 different races and have a different story for how they race. But our rule of thumb is that if there is an incumbent, then people know the incumbent well enough to know if they're going to vote for that person or not. And so if they're undecided, they're probably not going to break for the incumbent. That's the conventional wisdom. There are plenty of situations where that doesn't appear to have happened. But Kim Reynolds is not exactly an incumbent. She holds the title, but she's not won the seat in her own right. So I think this will be an interesting test.
We're told that, you know, the suburbs are the big place where this race may be decided, and a lot of legislative control issues may be decided in the suburbs. And you mentioned that Reynolds does well in rural Iowa. What can you tell us about the makeup of the suburbs and what's going on there historically, and maybe what you saw in the polling from September?
Well, I can tell you that the rural area that she won was the only geographic type of area that we test. Our question is, do you live in a city, a town, or in the country? Country we equate with rural. And there was not much difference between city and town, and Hubble won in those areas. So we don't strictly have a question that pulls out suburbs. But we also, my company is also conducting the Grinnell College National Poll, which launched right after Labor Day this year. And so we have a national look at what is happening with suburbs, because you're right, so many people are talking about that the suburbs were so important in electing Donald Trump. So what's happening there, because people are seeing some fall off. And I have a couple of numbers, if you'll just bear with me here. Nationally, with suburban voters, 56% disapprove of Trump. That's a high number. 60% are unfavorable to President Trump. On the generic congressional test, that is, do you plan to vote for a Democrat or Republican for your seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, it tips Democrat 49 to 35. That's a big gap. That's a 14-point gap in the suburbs across the United States. So those are indicators that suburban voters nationally are tilting toward Democrat. I can't tell you with certainty that that's happening here in Iowa, but one might suspect.
In the governor's race, in addition to accentuating their positives, both Governor Reynolds and Fred Hubble are pointing out each other's negatives. And you've identified some of those in your research, the criticisms of each candidate. How much weight should we give those criticisms, and are all criticisms equal?
Not all criticisms are equal, and that's why we bother to do a little bit of testing. And for me, I'm particularly concerned when a candidate's own supporters are concerned. And so one of the things we tested for Kim Reynolds was whether the privatization of Medicaid and her continued support for that was a problem.
We have a graphic of the criticisms of Reynolds that we'll put up.
That 51% of likely voters overall said that that was a big problem for her. And that overall among her supporters, you could say it was a big problem or a little problem or not a problem at all. Almost half of her own supporters said it was a big or little problem. So when you've got almost half of people who say, I'm going to vote for you, saying that's a problem, I think that's a problem. The other thing we tested was a question about whether she had mismanaged the budget. And again, 51% of the electorate considers that a big problem. That's less concerned among her own supporters, just 30%. And we also tested whether she had established her own agenda. Less important overall, less important with her own supporters. So you go back to that Medicare question and you just see how different that is, why that's a problem. That is a problem.
And the criticisms of Fred Hubbell?
For Fred Hubbell, clearly the biggest concern for him is whether he has shown enough transparency in the taxes that he's paid. And you heard about it in all of the debates, and you've seen a lot of advertising about it. But it's less, it tests less problematic for him. 36% of the electorate say that's a big problem. Now, it's 57% of his supporters who say it's either a big or little problem. So that's hard to ignore if you're Fred Hubbell, thinking about whether there might be some fall off among people who are inclined to support you if he doesn't do something to address that.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, as you look at all of the polling that you've done over your career, what's the bigger motivator? Being angry about something or being optimistic about something?
I'm going to say, and you asked me for my entire career, which, Kay, it's a long career. So I'm going to focus on recent memory.
Okay.
And I think that we saw extraordinary turnout in 2008, and that was a hope and change sort of election. We saw it in the Iowa caucuses, and then we saw it again there. The reason that Donald Trump did well, and this is true in Iowa and true probably in other states, was not so much that there was a surge in Republicans who were angry and wanted things to change, as there was a drop-off of Democrats showing up. And I was tipped off to that fact by Eric Branstad, who had done the work with the Secretary of State's data files. And we went and double-checked all of that. And indeed, that seems to be the case. So when you have a candidate like Hillary Clinton turned out to be, who kind of caused a sick feeling among her supporters, then there's less of an inclination to show up, or there's more an inclination to say, I can't support either one of these. And that ends up being the problem on that side.
Well, another reason I ask this question is, the president says, look at all of these economic indicators. 3.5% GDP growth was just reported this Friday. We had the tax package that we've given you tax cuts. But if you look at what Republican candidates are talking about who are running for federal office, they're not talking about those things.
Isn't that interesting? Because we tend to think conventional wisdom is you run on the economy. It's the economy, stupid. There are so many little storylines going on that I think it is really hard for a voter who is more purely independent and can see themselves voting for either party to kind of get distracted about, what is this election about? What does my vote mean in this election? So I feel like this is far more in flux, and that there's far more of a clear message about why a Democratic House, why keep a Republican House. I don't know that there's as much clarity in the rhetoric that's out there right now.
One of the other storylines we're watching is younger voters. In 2016, a presidential election, about 55% of the voters under age 35 voted. Over 35, it was 70% and above in each cohort. We've seen very active efforts on college campuses this year to register young voters. Do you get any sense of whether or not this is the year of the young voter, the year of the woman and the young voter?
Well, we saw that same activity on college campuses in 2008, and there was not much of an uptick about actual turnout among young voters. What I can tell you from our poll is that when we look at that youngest cohort, that is a Hubbell win by 2-1. So there's an interest there. I went back and looked at 2014. Terry Branstad won handily with that younger voter, 54% to 41% in the exit polling. So that's real, closer to real data than what our opinion poll would be. So that young voter isn't necessarily always what people think it's going to be in terms of how they're going to vote if they turn out, and that's always.
And we may stereotype, a lot of them are not in college.
A lot of them are not in college. That's right. That's right.
So what goes on a campus doesn't necessarily tell you how a blue-collar millennial is.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Good point.
Well, let's talk about associating with someone. You have a lot of attempts to bring in the star power. You had President Trump come into Council Bluffs a couple of weeks ago and give a full-throated endorsement of not only Congressman David Young, but Rod Blum and Steve King. This coming week, you have Vice President Biden coming in to sort of buttress Abby Finkenauer and Fred Hubbell. Does polling suggest that, you know, bringing in the big names, you've had Cory Booker out here and others campaigning with Democrats, does that motivate voters?
You know, the thoughtful answer is it depends. So in some ways, Donald Trump is doing a lot of these rallies, and you can watch them on television and not have to get up and go out and do that kind of thing. I don't know how much that's paying off anymore, and I don't know at this stage of the game how much his endorsement is doing. It did a lot for candidates in the primaries, and so that was helpful there. But because he is so polarizing, it may be giving people a reason to be motivated to vote against. On the Democratic side here in Iowa, of course, we've got some people coming to the state who are already starting their audition process and have as much motivation to sort of get themselves in front of Iowa Democrats as anything else. I think what campaigns use, what the campaigns call surrogates for, is to be one more reason for people to give thought to their candidate. Are they going to say something that's going to convince somebody who's sitting on the fence? That's hard to say. But if what they're doing is convincing them to go and get somebody else to come vote with you, then, you know, though it's more the messaging that becomes important than the messenger, probably.
And your Grinnell poll tried to sort of delve into activity.
Yes. One of the things that I've been interested in for a long time, my academic background is in communication theory and research from the University of Iowa. I should give a shout out to the Regents universities, which is how I became an Iowan. Was understanding that in communication, every utterance we could place on a continuum of expressive, which is I just have to say it, to instrumental, which is I'm trying to do something, I'm trying to make something happen. So children tend to be down here, they just say stuff, not without thinking too much, and candidates in particular tend to be on the instrumental side. Well, there's so much measurement in polling that is looking here. How do you feel? What is your enthusiasm? What is your intensity? What's that feeling? And I was curious about what they're doing. What are they trying to make happen? So we asked a list of questions about political behaviors and your intent, your expectation that you would be doing them in the near future, and then looked across various groups. And what jumped off the page were Democrats, a 50% number, saying there was an expectation that they would help other people vote in the near future. The number for Republicans, 34. So quite a gap there, kind of that shoe leather campaign work, which can result in additional votes cast.
James.
Over time, we've seen Iowa's cities grow. The rural area the population hasn't grown. And I want to ask, have you seen this affect voting behavior over the years? I mean, Governor Reynolds talks about Iowa as one big small town, and as people move from the country to the city, does that change their voting behavior? Or do they, you know, after 2 generations in the suburbs, are they still voting like they're on the farm?
Well, I think that's why suburbs sort of kind of are this flippy floppy kind of area, because often that's where the rural voters are moving. They're sort of moving to the edge of cities where that's a hybrid of kind of rural, kind of city. that's there. But I don't have any particular data that would explain that the reason you moved to the city is because you want to be around people who think more like you. It could go either way.
If I understand what you're saying is that some of those people are voting like rural voters, but not all of them.
There are people in the heart of Des Moines who vote like rural voters, so they're everywhere.
Okay.
I remember a conversation you and I had where you talked about how a lot of times it's hard to categorize an area or a county. What is Dallas County?
Right.
For example,
right.
Fastest growing county. It's got suburbs. It's got bona fide farms and rural areas. So what is it?
Exactly.
Small towns?
Exactly. Well, the census defines two types of areas: urban areas and everything else. So it's they're no help either.
And as you look at this polling, the latest polling data, and compare it to what happened in 2016, what's going on in Iowa that Trump carries the state in the 2016 election by 9 points, better than he did in Texas? And yet now you see a governor's race that's dead even. Any explanation for that?
I think that it's a little bit of Newton's law about for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
That's true.
So I think that's a piece of it. As I mentioned before, I think part of what happened in 2016 was a drop-off of interest in voting among Democrats, and that's going to change things. And a candidate that didn't feel like a fit for Iowa Democrats. And I feel that with Governor Reynolds and with Fred Hubbell, both parties feel good about their candidates, and that I think changes the tone and tenor of the race, and I feel like it's going to be a higher turnout because of it.
Right. Some Democrats regret that decision to stay home. James?
One of the new things we've seen in polling this cycle is live polling. The New York Times has been doing this live polling where they identify a district and you can log on and you can watch as they're making calls into that district. And I'm wondering, is this just a gimmick, a way to get me to click on their site? I mean, is it clickbait, or does this somehow increase our body of knowledge?
Well, I think Nate Cohn, who was heading this up, I'm friendly with him, the idea of doing it was to really be transparent about how polling works and to be an educational tool so that people could see, not just the polished up, fully weighted product when everything is said and done, but to see how things change over time. And they offered up all sorts of ways to look at the data and how to find a likely voter. So I think it did a very nice public service, and they looked at districts nobody else was looking at. So it's only because of the work they did that we have an idea about what's happening in Iowa's 1st district, which they've finished their work there, and perhaps a little too soon, but they were showing was a strong Democratic win, they thought, and the 3rd district, which looks very, very close. Again, they may have finished too soon to really see the end of the story.
That's true, because since they did that, you've got Vice President Joe Biden coming into that district, you've got House Speaker Ryan. Those people wouldn't be spending their time doing that if that race weren't in play.
There are no more public polls to take a look at, but you have to think their internal polls are driving that.
Okay.
What about the bandwagon effect?
What about it?
Do people jump on who they think the winner is? What percentage of people do that?
Well, I think the bandwagon effect is more a matter of what your friends and neighbors are talking about that might convince you to do it, rather than you sitting by yourself and thinking, oh, I want to go with a winner. I don't think it's a solitary decision. I think it is a community decision and influenced.
And what is the effect of big major news events? What will be the effect, for example, on this election of this caravan that's forming in Mexico, coming to the U.S. border, and soon the president calling up troops, and there'll be those optics. What's the effect of that? What's the effect of these bomb scares that we're having? What does that do to an electorate?
Well, it partly depends on how they're talked about, rather than the event themselves. I mean, that's more, to me, that's what I see more and more. It's the spin on it. So the caravan is more than 1,000 miles away, not likely to be here very soon, and yet they're sending military down way ahead of that in order to create an optic. So if that's persuasive that there's a clear and present danger right now, then that's okay. But if you decide that, wow, that appears to just be theater, then that's going to play the other way. What the point I want to make is that these last days before the election, you have to think of them in dog years, because there's so much happening that can potentially be a game changer, that anybody who tells you that even when the final poll is in, that something couldn't happen is dreaming.
One game that doesn't change is our clock. We're out of time. Ann, thanks for coming out again and sharing your intelligence and insight with us.
Always a pleasure.
Appreciate it. And thank you for joining us. We'll be back with another edition of Iowa Press at our regular times next week, 7:30 Friday night, with a rebroadcast at noon on Sunday on our main channel, as well as a replay Saturday morning at 8:30 on our .3 World Channel. For all of us here at Iowa Public Television, I'm David Yepsen, and thanks for joining us today.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.